Hello, everyone. I'm Arfa Alam from the Partnership for Public Service, and in collaboration with our friends at the Boston Consulting Group, I'm pleased to welcome you to the kickoff event for our 2021 Best Places to Work in the Federal Government Ranking Cycle and our very first LinkedIn Live this year. Today, we're planning to chat about what federal employee engagement looks like in the future of work and during the Great Resignation, especially as it relates to young workers and issues around DEIA, two topics that were highlighted in our Best Places to Work 15th edition report. Our panelists include audience favorites from last year. First, from our amazing partners at the Boston Consulting Group, with whom we're partnering for the 5th year to bring you the rankings, we have Managing Director and Partner Brooke Boyke. Brooke is based in Washington, D.C. and leads BCG's federal practice and people and workforce topics within the federal government. Welcome, Brooke.
Thanks so much for having me.
And from the partnership's very own, we have our Vice President of Federal Workforce Programs, Michelle Amonte. Great to have you with us, Michelle.
Thanks, Arfa. Great to be here.
So before we jump into the discussion, I want to let you, our audience, know that we will be releasing the 2021 Best Places to Work rankings this summer. So please stay tuned to our LinkedIn page and our other social media platforms for an announcement around the official release date, as well as other exciting employee engagement content we have planned for you all, including a brand new video speaker series. And during our conversation today, we want to hear from you. So please feel free to send us your comments and questions, and we'll do our best to respond. And with that, I think we should dive in. So Michelle, the future of work is now. It's here and we're in the thick of it. Our federal workforce continues to navigate a new normal as they return to the office amidst the Great Resignation, which has and continues to force a reckoning for organizations, leaders, and employees alike. Why should employee engagement, which Brooke once called rocket fuel for organizations, continue to be a priority in the future of work?
Well, thank you for the question. So, what's interesting is the partnership started doing this work back in 2003. And, almost 20 years ago, the concept of employee engagement was very much this HR niche term. Certainly employee morale was recognized, but the concept of having an engaged workforce and how that impacts organizational performance was really new. And so it was in 2003 that we launched the Best Places to Work in the federal government. And throughout the course of the last almost 20 years, we have continued to demonstrate this link between the two. And one of my favorite things about the report that we released last summer that you mentioned, Arfa, was this business case to continue to demonstrate that employee engagement does have a direct effect on organizational performance. And we highlighted case studies at the Treasury and at VA. And we could see, particularly at the VA, that as employee engagement increased, so did patient satisfaction. So to go back to your question, certainly it has to be a priority because we expect agencies to continue to achieve their mission and continue to work towards, better and stronger organizational performance. So they have to continue to think about employee engagement and their rocket fuel, as Brooke mentioned it last time that we spoke about this topic. And that doesn't mean that it's going to change, or that doesn't mean it's not going to change over the years, right? How we engage our workforce is going to, continue to evolve and adapt. And certainly over the past 2 years, agencies have been turned upside down on how they're interacting with their workforce. But the concept of engagement itself always has to be a priority when we're thinking about mission performance.
Completely agree, Michelle. I didn't know that my rocket fuel comment was going to have such lasting power. But still agree with it. Arfa, you started off by talking about the Great Resignation. And I think that when we think about the future of work, part of what the Great Resignation is showing us is that employee engagement needs to become an even more prominent pillar of what we're doing. I mean, estimates are that about 45% of the workforce is considering moving jobs right now. You had almost 50 million people in 2021 across the whole workforce move jobs. And a lot of people cite pay, and definitely, I mean, pay and certain benefits, there's a bar you have to hit. And people need to make what they feel that they need to make or want to. But once you hit that bar, engagement is what makes employees sticky, right? It's what makes people want to continue to stay. And it's not a one size fits all, unfortunately. It would be so easy if you could say, here's this one lever, here's this one thing that will make your employees sticky and want to stay and retain all of the knowledge and skills in your organization. But it's not one size fits all. And we know that there's certain elements that in general correlate really strongly. A big one of them is trust. Trusting your employer, trusting your teammates, trusting your direct supervisor is actually one of the biggest ones. And so that community and that trust, but other things, and we're talking about, you kicked off talking about younger workers. For younger workers, trust is really important. So is learning and development. So is an idea that you can have career advancement. So I think it's really important when agencies get their FEVS result, which will be, hopefully this summer, our next round of those coming out, when get their FEVS results, cut by distinct group, whether it's younger workers, whether it's different demographics, cut by those, but also don't just rely on those. Most organizations that I work with on the private sector side do regular pulse checks of how are people doing every month, really short, like 3 questions, 5 questions, or quarterly 10 questions. And so keep on top of that in terms of how you're thinking about where you're targeting your engagement.
So, Brooke, you just mentioned trust as being really important, and trust is a very timely topic right now. Mm-hmm. What else should agencies be thinking about, and what tactically can agencies do about it?
Yeah, I mean, so to my point, it's not like a one size fits all. So you should be thinking about within different groups. Learning and development is very highly correlated, right? So do I have the right development programs? Can people see a future here? Can they see things coming here? You should also be thinking about potentially what are my different groups in terms of who needs to be in person and who cannot be in person right now, who has the opportunity. People in general call these knowledge workers, people who don't necessarily have to be in person. I don't like that term because an emergency room technician needs to be in person, and you certainly have knowledge, as does someone who works in a manufacturing plant, right? So I like to call them desk and deskless workers, right? And so when you're thinking about deskless workers, people who have the opportunity to be hybrid, being really thoughtful about that is tremendously important as well. Michelle, I don't know your take on it.
No, I think it's, obviously, we keep hearing trust continuously. And we're doing a lot of research as a partnership on trust within the federal workforce and also trust externally. It's not a surprise that there isn't a lot of trust in the federal government in general. But we're trying to understand more about that in terms of how can we help change that message to better help recruit employees into the federal government and certainly help with retention issues. I think a lot of this goes back to what you just mentioned, Brooke, in just staying in constant communication with your employees, whether that is pulse surveys, whether that is focus groups, just being able to listen to them and then do something about it. The question has changed on the FEVS. It used to be question 41, but it got to the heart of are you going to do, or do you believe your leadership is going to do anything with this information? And when that is a proxy for trust, right? Yep. Do you believe that this data means anything to your leadership? And that question remains on the FEVS, and it's an important one to track, because if your workforce doesn't believe that their voice matters, you have to work on that before you can work on anything else. So I think just being in constant communication, showing your workforce that you're listening to them and that you're doing something about it is really the very first step for federal agencies.
Completely agree.
Michelle, I want to come back to the topic of trust, but Brooke, you brought up desk-based and deskless jobs, right? Which brings to the forefront this experimentation that we're doing right now with hybrid work. And a lot of learning is happening around that. There's been a lot of research, including from our friends at BCG, that has shown that remote and hybrid work, it's brought about unexpected benefits and increased equity for some groups, but it's also compounded existing inequities, particularly for underrepresented groups. So how should agencies be thinking about this?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And this is impacting a subset. This is impacting our desk-based workers who even have this opportunity, and not everyone does. But it's a really interesting social experiment that's happening right now with this. And we one of the partnerships we do is with Slack on something called the Future Forum, which brings together leaders across government and private sector to talk about these workplace trends and what we're seeing. And it's really interesting. In a recent survey that we did with them, looking across all sectors, more than a third of desk-based workers who were originally remote have now come back 5 days a week, full time, and are really there in person all the time now. And with that shift, we have seen engagement scores among that group drop significantly across all categories. There's 8 different categories. It's dropped. I mean, anxiety, work-related stress is the highest that it's ever been. So, going all the way back doesn't seem like necessarily the right move for everyone at the same, and at the same time, you're right that being 100% remote was causing some challenges as well. In particular, the people that we see, to your point of equity, this being impacted the most are underrepresented groups, including people of color, including women, including working parents, in particular working mothers, but working parents that are really reporting the greatest need to be having some type of flexibility in timing or location. And it's men and women, right? So it's like 58% of women and 48% of men. So but important to both, right? It's almost 50% of all men. It's not just women who are looking at this. So I think when you're thinking about D&I, having some layer of flexibility is really important because these are the groups that really want and need it. The question is how, right? And how you're doing it can compound or can lessen the inequity. So some examples of, first of all, being purposeful about it and segmenting types of tasks and types of roles that can be remote and not, and showing a rationale for it, because it can create an immense amount of dissatisfaction if it feels like it's random. And it's like, this person's friends with this person and they got this benefit and they get to do it. There has to be consistency. There has to be a logic behind it. You also need to be really mindful that it can be harder to have your voice heard if you're remote and everyone else is in person. Right. And so if women and underrepresented groups are also the ones who want to be remote and are also not in the room, that can make it harder. And so something to think about there is creating norms and solutions for, hey, in the room, everyone's still going to be logged in and we're going to be using the chat on the side. So everyone has equal access to it. Being thoughtful about, hey, some meetings we'll only do in person. Some meetings everyone will go remote. And then other things like balancing benefits, right? There can be a lot of resentment of saying, oh, you get commuting benefits, but I don't get any work from home subsidies. Those types of things that if you do it in a smart way, you can help to lessen the impact of inequity across groups.
Michelle, anything to add?
No, those are all very, very important points. And I appreciate all the data coming out of the Future Forum. We've been watching it closely and it's great trends to watch. I think it's funny, 2 years ago when we went remote, it felt really hard. And now 2+ years later, hybrid seems so much harder, right? Because at least to your point, Brooke, about like the desk-based workers, and I do really like that term so much more than knowledge workers, but the desk-based workers, everyone was in the same boat for at least that group. And now we're moving into this new future where there's so much flux and so much change. And to your point, who stays remote, who doesn't? How do we make everybody feel like they are fully included in the work and in decisions? It's hard. So I think the first thing that leaders need to do is recognize it's hard, be transparent with their workforce, be agile and flexible to things that the federal government is not strong at, but just knowing that you're not going to get it right the first time, right? So I think that's one thing that they have to acknowledge and be really open with their workforce about. Last June, the executive order on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility came out. And I think as the agency submitted their plans this past spring, Most agencies are moving towards having a chief diversity officer, and this has to be something that's, part of that work is thinking about how does hybrid work or how does remote work impact different populations in different ways. And so I think we're going to continue to watch this issue, continue to encourage OPM and the chief diversity officers to be monitoring this and making sure that as their best places to work results come out this summer, and as we look at the diversity and inclusion scores, that populations are not being adversely impacted.
I'd like to dig in on something that Brooke mentioned in her response. So we're talking about equity, and young workers and diverse groups, they have concerns about the impact that in-person FaceTime or lack thereof may have on their career paths and promotion potential, right? Brooke, what questions should supervisors be asking themselves to avoid this pitfall of letting in-person FaceTime drive promotion rather than actual performance?
Well, I would say what it comes down to is success metrics, and in government that's harder than the private sector because there's no bottom line. There's no like, hey, we ended up with this number at the end of the year. It can, sometimes it's very clear. Sometimes it can be very amorphous to define like a success metric for a specific mission and a specific directorate within. It's harder to do, but when you can start indexing success around accomplishments versus around attendance versus I can see you, that's when you start really opening the aperture for flexibility and empowering people to be making decisions about how they spend their time so that they will be most successful, and everyone's on the same page about what happens at the end of that. What does that look like? I hear a lot of people saying, well, if people aren't here in person, how do I know they're working? How do I know they're doing? But how did you know they were working before? Just because they're sitting at their computer doesn't mean they're working. It doesn't mean that they're productive or that they're productive doing the right things. They could be doing anything on there, right? And so even if people are in person, having that sort of aligned on like, what's my output at the end of this and what does good look like really helps expand in many ways.
And I'd like to go back to one more point you mentioned when I first asked the question, why should employee engagement continue to be a priority? You and Michelle both talked about how, and you talked about this a bit during our last LinkedIn Live last year, but how young workers, they want to know that there is a future for them when they join organizations. There is a quote in our 15th edition report from last year. Eleanor Snow from the U.S. Geological Survey, she states that young people are really interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when they look around at an organization of mostly folks who don't perhaps look like them, they wonder where their place is. So, Michelle, how can agencies demonstrate to younger, diverse populations that there is, in fact, a place for them now and in the future, even when the current demographics may not physically reflect them?
Yeah, that's a great question and not an easy answer to it. I think some of this ties into the trust work that I mentioned earlier, right? And how, historically there have been disproportionate negative impacts to different underrepresented populations. I do think the executive order on equity is certainly helping to improve that. The equity action plans just came out last week, and that all will have an impact on getting younger people more excited about government and building trust with diverse populations. Having said that, that doesn't mean you have to wait, right? We can't wait for 2 decades for all of that work to turn around before we get younger people into government. And some agencies are much more proactive about reaching out to diverse populations, working with HBCUs. In our report, we talked about NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they work with external professional organizations and affinity groups that are focused on underrepresented populations to build trust within those communities and help spread the word about scientific jobs within NOAA. But it does take proactive outreach, right? Like this, students in general are not just going to come to the federal government. They don't understand the breadth of jobs that are available. It's very difficult to navigate the hiring process. So agencies have to go to them. They have to inspire them. They have to show them the types of jobs that are available. They have to show them people that look like them, people under 30, people of all different races and ethnic groups. And so one thing that we're doing at the partnership next week, we are relaunching our gogovernment.org website, which is really primarily focused on young people and getting them excited about government work. And we're going to be doing some of these things at the partnership, but we also want to encourage agencies to be doing their own work in this space, and really encouraging and working with different universities and student groups to get excited about government service.
Yeah.
And sorry, Brooke. I was going to follow up and ask, Brooke, can you speak more to once agencies have attracted the young talent, best practices for keeping them there? As you may recall, again, from our LinkedIn Live last year, Michelle noted a statistic about federal government workers under the age of 30 who voluntarily resigned in the year 2020. From among that group, more than 75% of them had only had a tenure of less than 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a mind meld. I was going to the same place, which is, neither Michelle nor I underestimate the challenge of recruiting. We know how many challenges and hurdles there are to get people in the door in the first place. But the battle's not over then. Once you get them in, you must keep them. And when we have when we talk about DE&I especially, but I think that this equally applies to younger workers, is that if someone gets in a place and they don't see role models and they don't look up and see that could be me, it's really hard to make them feel engaged and to have them stay there for a career. So a couple of things is, first, a really concerted onboarding program that shows them the value of their contributions, shows them that they're a value part of that organization, helps them to understand what to expect, helps them to understand how to fit in. There are often sort of unspoken norms in organizations of how you operate, and you just sort of absorb them over time. But in particular, if you came from a non-traditional background, there might be certain assumed knowledge that you have that you don't going into it, and someone needs to explicitly lay that out to you. And as a piece of that onboarding, and I'm not just talking about like 2 days when you start, I'm talking about, over your first year plus. One of those is mentoring. And mentoring can be formal mentoring. It can be a certain program. It can be a cohort that it goes through. It could be one-on-one. It can be informal. But something that connects people with more senior people who can help to show them the path and can also help them figure out how to move around roadblocks, because often there's a step way that you go through a career, and particularly younger or more diverse hires who have different expectations for their career than people 20, 30 years ago did, might need some help in figuring out, well, how do I work around the fact that this isn't what I'm interested in, but I'd like to be here for a longer, like, how does that work together? Which could mean doing externships, it could mean doing rotations, details, things like that. I think one of the things we talk about in the report is, USGS has a resource dedicated to young scientists, to like creating a community of young scientists to understand, help understand the place, help understand how employees can network together with peers, and also help the institution understand what's important to young scientists and what do they need to be successful.
Well, one thing to that, I believe that the lack of onboarding program for young people is really the biggest issue in retention. Truly, I think that if they felt like they had more of a community and had that mentorship from other folks, either within their agency or even across government, that really is the missing piece. And so that is one thing that we've really been encouraging agencies to think about and invest in if they want to retain their people under 30.
Well, time has really been flying, and I just realized we're almost out of time. I would like to get to at least one question from our audience before I get some final thoughts from both of you. One of our audience members asks, what if there is no strong rationale for getting employees back into the office? How should agencies think about the hybrid or not hybrid model, I guess, in that case?
I'm happy to start. Thank
Please.
you, Jason, for that question. I think this is our biggest challenge to employee engagement, frankly, is the federal government slipping back into old ways, being too rigid about hybrid or remote working options. I think it goes back to what Brooke said a few minutes ago about performance, right? There is this fear that if we have a large percentage of the federal workforce not working in the office, then that means they aren't going to be doing their jobs. Despite what happened over the last 2 years, right? Despite the fact that people have been doing their jobs and working successfully over the last 2 years, there is a fear that if they continue to work in that fashion, they will not perform. And frankly, the statistics are just not playing out that way. So I think that, once again, if you have strong performance plans, like agencies should have had pre-pandemic, and you're able to measure people's performance against those plans, then there really is no strong rationale for across the board going back to work. Now, obviously, it depends on the job. Every single job cannot be remote. And I believe the stat was, only 45% of the federal workforce was working remote. Anyway, during the pandemic, over 55% had to be, whether it was law enforcement or people working in labs, et cetera. So, but of that 45%, really taking the time to look at each job, deciding what are, the qualities of that job and if they should be remote, and then focusing on performance is really the way to go versus being arbitrary about everybody going back to work or not going back to work.
Yeah, I completely agree, Michelle. If there's not a rationale, then don't. But sit and think through what would the rationale be. And I think this is an important thing to parse apart, is the difference between proximity and connectedness. And so proximity is like you're physically next to me, like we're sitting in the same office, I can be near you. Connectedness is like we work together well. We connect, I understand you, you understand me. We have a vibe going, to put it in a non-scientific way. And when everyone suddenly went remote, what you saw is that employees who were satisfied with their social connectivity in their office, 85% of them thought that they were as productive or more productive before COVID-19. So the connectedness kept them together. People who were not satisfied with it, only 65% thought they were. So a really big difference. Now, I think the challenge you run into when we're a couple of years into this, and if you're thinking of permanently moving into only remote, is how do you create connectedness when you never have proximity, right? So, my personal view is that in general, there is a role for both. And the question is how much? I think you probably need some level of in-person. Maybe it's a couple times a year you get together and you have a retreat and you create your connectedness there. Maybe it's once a month, and everyone needs to work that out given their own personal considerations. But I think that everyone should be thinking about connectedness and how do I drive that versus like, how much should I be sitting next to you?
Well, I think we've already touched on this a bit, but for final thoughts, Brooke, can you tell us what you think the most pressing issue in terms of employee engagement is facing federal government agencies, especially as it relates to young workers and diverse populations?
Yeah, and with the risk of retreading conversations that we've had, I mean, I think the biggest risk is that people come into an organization, they are full of optimism, and they look up and they don't see anyone like them. And I think that keeping that focus on retaining people for those first few years and the mentorship and getting them engaged then is going to be paying dividends 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Michelle, do you have any final thoughts on that?
As leaders, we cannot take our own personal preferences and put them on our workforce, right? Unnecessarily. So if we have a preference to be in the office every day, if there is not a business reason for our employees to be in the office every day, then we shouldn't necessarily force that upon our workforce. And I think especially, we talked a lot this afternoon about younger employees, Generation Z. They will not come into the office every day. They just won't, right? Like they are used to having flexibility and autonomy. And so how do we bridge this gap between what Generation Z is looking for in a workplace and flexibility and our needs to build a pipeline into federal service. And I think that is a huge risk and something that leaders need to be thinking about.
Well, with that, we will have to conclude our LinkedIn Live for today. But before we go, I just want to thank our panelists again, Brooke and Michelle. That was a great discussion. And thank you for not just joining us, but continuing to be champions and friends of the Best Places program. And a very special thanks to our audience. Thank you for your support and enthusiasm around the Best Places program, which is greatly appreciated by all of us at the partnership and BCG. And as I said before, please stay tuned to our social media platforms for an official release date announcement for our summer rankings. And don't hesitate to reach out to us in the meantime should you have any questions.